Hey everybody, welcome to CNN Newsroom. I'm Paulo Sandoval live in New York. Another election night in America has come and gone. We've got updates on the big races and finally a projected winner in Wisconsin. And President Trump is speaking out about his Air Force One shell game triggered by an Iranian threat, while he says he went along with it. And how scientists plan to use today's solar eclipse to test a new instrument that could change how they study the sun.
Live from New York, this is CNN Newsroom with Paulo Sandoval.
All right, everybody, 4 a.m. here in New York, 3 a.m. in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And after a very long night of ballot counting, CNN can now project Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley will be the one to advance to the governor's race as after he secured the Democratic nomination for governor. He had been locked in a very tight race with State Assembly member Francesca Hung. Crowley had dropped out of the race in early June, but then re-entered just days later with support of Wisconsin's outgoing governor. Well, later this year, he's set to face Republican Congressman Tom Tiffany, who does have the endorsement of President Donald Trump. And we're also following races across 5 other states, including South Carolina. The special Republican Senate primary there will be going to a runoff, and this after no candidate secured a majority of the vote. CNN projecting Darlene Graham, the sister of the late Senator Lindsey Graham, and Congressman Ralph Norman will compete in that runoff election in just 2 weeks.
I want to thank the Republican voters of South Carolina for having confidence in me. I look forward to the next 2 weeks, meeting with you, listening to your concerns, and telling you more about me and my conservative values.
All right, let's go to Caroline Hellman, who is a Democratic strategist and professor of critical theory and social justice at Occidental College. She joins me live from Los Angeles. It's always great to see you, Caroline. Another long night of primary election results.
Yes, indeed. Great to see you, Polo.
So let's start with David Crowley. I mean, he went from being out of the race to getting back in the race and now being the one to advance to face off the Republican in the race for the governor of that state. What's your initial reaction and what do you think this matchup will look like as he gets ready to face the Republicans come November?
Well, Crowley pulling it out is actually pretty surprising. Hung was so far ahead. Francesca Hung, the Democratic Socialist candidate, was so far ahead in the polls. You know, very similar to what happened in Michigan in the primary last week, although El Sayed was able to pull it out, Hung was not. I mean, she's pulling well ahead, and then the centrist Democratic candidate ended up clinching the Democratic primary nomination moving forward. And I think, you know, it really comes down to one primary thing, which is electability. So even though a lot of voters may have told pollsters that they were supporting more the Democratic Socialist agenda, maybe it was some of the more inflammatory things that Hong said, but at the end of the day, they went with a candidate that was simply more electable.
This also reminded me of, you and I were talking not too long ago with the Stevens El Sayed primary race there. And then, you and I were discussing the lingering question now about how both campaigns would be able to unify their supporters against their Republican opponent. I'll pose the same question here. How do you see the David Crowley campaign uniting with some of the members of or at least Francesca Hong supporters? Is that pretty easy to do, you think?
I do think it's easy to do because as hard fought as these primary campaigns are, once you're headed into the general election, you have a unified opponent or villain, if you will, in the contemporary political age. We're really talking about villainizing opponents. And so I would imagine that it will not be an issue for these candidates to come forth and perhaps campaign together. What we see is this fight, right, for the soul of the Democratic Party. party, whether it's the centrists versus the Democratic Socialists, or in some case just the socialist label. Francesca Hong supporters were very vocal. She was popular in the state as a restaurateur who went from one location to the next, really doing, pressing the flesh. So even though she has lost this race, it was so close that Crowley will definitely need those votes headed into the general election. And when I talked about electability earlier, it's really, I think, a calculus where voters in Wisconsin and elsewhere, while these Democratic Socialists have very popular platforms in terms of universal health care and a number of other policies, at the end of the day, they're looking to see who's going to be a Trump-backed Republican come the general election.
Do you see Democratic Socialists looking at Francesca Hong's performance and taking something away that they could lead them to reconsider their approach in future elections, you think?
I actually think that this was much more about the particular candidate. It was about Francesca Hong, who had talked about maybe not celebrating Thanksgiving, about defunding the police, about maybe abolishing the Senate. So she had taken these much more extreme positions, mostly in her online history. And so while she walked a lot of that back, you'll notice that she didn't get endorsements from Bernie Sanders or AOC, really the stars of the Democratic Socialist movement right now. And so I think when you see the victory of someone like Dr. El Sayed compared to Francesca Hong, it really maybe came down to that particular candidate not being able to distance herself enough from the so-called woke one agenda that AOC referenced earlier this week.
Yeah, Hong's stumbles, especially towards the tail end, really curbed that momentum that she had. You also talked about, just a little while ago, we may see from Republicans, Wisconsin Republicans did have their hopes on a race against Francesca Hong. How are you expecting them now to go after Crowley for the next several months?
I think their strategy is pretty clear, which is to essentially drag every Democratic candidate over into the Democratic Socialist camp, right? And paint them as being maybe more extreme than they are, and paint them as being out of touch with the electorate. It's a very successful strategy, I think, that we've seen, certainly in terms of a unified message from the Republican Party, which they tend to be very good at doing. And in this particular race, Polo, you point out that they wanted Tiffany to go up against Hong in this general election because they just thought he would have a much better chance. But at the end of the day, the money that the Republican Party threw in to support Hong's candidacy just didn't get her across the line. Those voters in Wisconsin are really looking, I think, forward to November and saying, yeah, I like her issues, even, maybe she didn't distance herself enough, but at the end of the day, they see Crowley as being maybe more electable running against a Trump-backed Republican.
Let the real race begin now in the state of Wisconsin. Caroline Hellman, as always, always look forward to your perspective and your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
We're also learning new details about the covert operation to get President Trump on a secret flight out of Turkey last month. The New York Times reporting that the U.S. had identified a threat of an Iranian assassination plot, which potentially included a surface-to-air missile targeting the presidential jet. President Trump spoke about that secret plane swap on Tuesday night and said this.
It's only up to Secret Service. I just follow what they'd like to do. So I go by Secret Service and the military. They wanted me to go on a different flight, a different plane, equal safety, but they wanted me to do it, so I do it. I do what they say. Well, I don't know. I think actually the plane that I flew on was at greater risk. I think it was at greater risk because that would be the plane I think that they would be more likely to go for. I don't worry about anything, to be honest. Whatever it is, my attitude, whatever.
So how did this covert switch play out? CNN's Elena Treen with those details.
CNN is learning of this elaborate ruse that the president and his team had designed to move him onto a separate plane back when he was traveling in Turkey for the NATO summit. Essentially, we see the president boarding the old Air Force One last month to leave that summit. That's what we were told, at least. But if you look closely, there was a catering truck that's highlighted under Air Force One. Minutes after stepping aboard the plane, a U.S. official told CNN that the president secretly moved into a truck in a clandestine move to protect him. Now, all of this was unfolding as journalists and even some White House staffers were still boarding the plane and were told that the president was on that plane as well. I can't say just how remarkable a operation like this is and how atypical and really unprecedented it is. I'd remind you that the president had initially traveled to that NATO summit in Turkey on the new Air Force One that was gifted to the president from Qatar last year. It had all the new bells and whistles that the president has loved to publicize. But then they learned that they were going to be taking an older plane, the former plane that was used for Air Force One when leaving Turkey, and then they would stop in the United Kingdom for a refueling stop before heading back to Washington. The president had initially said that the reason for that was because there were U.S. service members on the ground in England who wanted to go on board and tour the new Qatari jet. However, CNN had reported in recent weeks that it was actually because of a threat from Iran. We had also reported that Israel had briefed some of the president's team on this threat before departing, but it was not known that the president had taken a separate plane known as a C-32A, that is a military aircraft, and he had done so all in the way of decepting the media on board. I do think what this shows is just reflective of how serious and credible the White House believed these threats from Iran were. I also think it raises questions about the capabilities that Iran has to target the most secure plane in the world. I will say, in retrospect, hindsight is 2020, that when you're looking at some of the signs that had happened on the ground that day, there were some things that were suspicious. One of them had been, and we got this from the great reporters who sent their pool reports throughout the day while in Turkey, that staff on board the plane had asked reporters to lower the shades to their windows. Not something typical for flights like this. We also know that once the flight had landed in the UK for that refueling stop, they had also taken an unusually long amount of time to have press leave the back of the plane. Later, of course, you did see the shot of Trump deboarding the plane. So clearly they had brought him back onto the plane to see him exit. All to say, we have not gotten a confirmation from the White House, but we also have not gotten a denial to this. And I will note that in the past, we have seen some presidents be a little bit deceptive about their travel, but not to the extent of 4 weeks and really a month now, arguing that the president had traveled on a plane when he didn't. Elena Treen, CNN, the White House.
Joining us now is Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Director of the Iran Program with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you, Paulo. Thank you.
So I'm sure you've been following that reporting closely, and some of this latest round of reporting from the New York Times that now shows that during the president's trip to last month's NATO summit, U.S. intelligence learned of a threat that was essentially two-pronged, that there was a specific threat of a surface-to-air missile against Air Force One, or whatever aircraft the president was aboard, and then this one, that the Iranians knew specifically where Mr. Trump was staying in Turkey. So they covertly flew him out on that secret flight, as we all know, and as the president confirmed late Tuesday. But I'm more interested in just the seriousness of this threat. I mean, clearly the Secret Service considered it serious enough that they moved forward with this operation. So what does it tell you about Iran's capability in the region? I mean, the Trump administration has repeatedly asserted that Iran's regime has been severely debilitated.
Well, great to be with you. And it's a pretty crazy story because we're learning more as it really develops. The Washington Post and NBC, some pretty important exclusives and scoops on this. But ultimately, this is a story more about intention than capability. You know, this is a regime that has hired, guns for hire in the past that try to go against dissidents and foreign targets. But for many years now, they've been talking about actually wanting to kill the president. They've raised money. They've issued fatwas. They've issued threats officially and unofficially from government authorities and also from religious centers and media centers. But this story is a little bit different because clearly the Secret Service is acting on even the slight probability or the slight chance of the regime being able to do one of those two things. And the story that was reported by NBC and by the Washington Post about the president hiding in, a catering container and moving planes, for example, that too just tells you how seriously, government authorities and the Secret Service were taking it and not leaving things to a low probability, high impact chance.
And then on the reporting from the New York Times that the Iranians knew specifically where the president was staying in Ankara, including even the floor of the building, according to that reporting. Just how concerning is that to you? I mean, should that kind of information be easy to get, especially for the Iranians that have threatened the president in the past?
I mean, if at that granular level the Islamic Republic knows this, or its authorities or proxies or agents or guns for hire know it, it's a problem, and it's a problem because A, how did the information get out? B, was this inadvertently put out publicly and then removed? Or C, did they use local sources? And lest we forget, Turkey is a very permissive jurisdiction for Iran-backed intelligence activity and proxy activity. In the past, they've been, deportations of Turkey of political prisoners that were Iranian or refugees that were Iranian that actually folks worried about meeting a fate perhaps worse than death back in Iran. Inside of Turkey, of course, as you know, there's also been the long arm of Iran's Ministry of Intelligence, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So there's certainly some level of security state penetration by a neighbor of Turkey, which, by the way, is a NATO country. But to bring it back to what you mentioned earlier about the dichotomy between this long arm of Iran-backed terror, or this intentionality of doing something, and what the White House has long talked about, which is this diminishing capability, I think we're seeing two things quite quickly converge, which is that this can be a less capable regime, but it is still a pretty confident regime. And this is a regime that might be on the surface, on the macroeconomics of it, on the conventional military side, weak, but on the asymmetric side, quite lethal.
And given those abilities, then, just looking back at last month's visit to Turkey, do you think that the president should have accepted the Turkish president's invitation to attend that summit, considering everything you've just laid out?
Considering everything I said, certainly I think it's always wise to go to the territory of a NATO country, but perhaps it does underscore two things. One, the problems, of course, with the switcheroo, given the fact that the president had to board a different plane, and the fact that he actually boarded the Qatari newer Air Force One back when he was in London. So it shows, some of the initial concerns about that first plane were actually quite valid and quite true. And second, I would also say here, by the way, you don't want this to fit in the mind of any adversarial state that the territory of any NATO country is not a safe country to go to. But that being said, Turkey is not necessarily a NATO country in the best standing, given its kind of mixed foreign policy orientation of other issues that the rest of the alliance is pretty solid on. And here I'm not talking about Russian issues, I'm talking about Middle Eastern issues.
Ben Teleblue, thank you so much for joining us as always and providing all this analysis.
Thank you.
Well, the U.S. president says that Iran would, quote, get blown away if it tries to do something in the Strait of Hormuz. And this comes as Donald Trump insists that the U.S. still has total control over the critical waterway. Well, meanwhile, the Trump administration now warning of higher oil and gas prices into next year. The latest shakeup in Iran's military leadership, it could be a sign that Tehran and Washington are far from striking a deal. Iran's supreme leader reportedly appointed 6 hardliners to top security positions this week. Rescue teams across Colombia are racing to find survivors after Monday's devastating earthquake. Still ahead, a volunteer describes how crews were able to rescue a baby from the rubble.
Pollen in your